The silence in the church was suffocating. My mother's funeral wasn't supposed to go this way, but when Uncle Richard grabbed my elbow as I approached the podium and whispered, "You shouldn't speak, Kate. Nobody wants to hear from you after what you did," something inside me snapped. I'd spent 32 years letting my mother's family dictate my worth, watching them rewrite our history to paint me as the ungrateful daughter who abandoned her sick mother. I looked down at the folded papers in my trembling hands, not the eulogy I'd spent days writing, but my mother's will that had arrived by courier that morning. The attorney's note attached had been clear, in case of objections, as if she'd known exactly what would happen today. I smiled at Uncle Richard, pulled away from his grip, and walked to the podium with newfound confidence. They'd been hiding something for years, and Mom's final act was giving me permission to expose it all. I unfolded the papers, cleared my throat, and watched the color drain from my uncle's face as he realized what I was holding. "Before I begin," I said into the microphone, "I think it's time everyone heard what my mother actually wanted." My mother, Eleanor Wright, was the backbone of a New England dynasty built on old lumber money and newer pharmaceutical patents. The Wrights of Bristol County, Massachusetts, were fixtures at charity galas, hospital wing dedications, and the occasional society scandal, always carefully managed by my grandfather and later Uncle Richard, the family fixer. I was the product of my mother's brief marriage to my father, Daniel Harrison, a marine biologist she met during her rebellious phase at Wellesley. Their love was intense but short-lived. When I was 4, he died in a research accident off the Maine coast. After that, we moved back to the Wright family compound, a sprawling Victorian mansion where my mother reclaimed her maiden name, and I became the odd Harrison among Wrights. Uncle Richard and Aunt Vivian had 3 perfect children, Richard Jr., Elizabeth, and Charlotte, all Wright in name and temperament. Family dinners were exercises in psychological warfare. I remember my 12th birthday dinner when Uncle Richard raised his glass and announced, "To Catherine, who despite her father's unfortunate genetics, might still make something of herself." Everyone laughed as if he'd told a charming joke. My teenage years were worse. During my cousin Elizabeth's sweet 16, I overheard Aunt Vivian telling other mothers that, "Poor Eleanor is doing her best with Catherine, but you can't outrun bad blood." When I confronted her, Uncle Richard pulled me aside, explaining that Harrisons are emotional, Wrights are dignified, and I was embarrassing my mother. Through it all, Mom remained distant, trapped between defending me and placating her controlling brother. She'd whisper apologies in private, but never challenged them publicly. Her illness began when I was in college, a rare autoimmune disorder that gradually consumed her. I'd rush home from Cornell weekends to care for her, while Uncle Richard managed her affairs. The grand gesture came during my senior year. Mom announced she was establishing the Harrison Wright Scholarship for marine biology students in my father's memory. It was the first time she'd publicly honored him in years. Uncle Richard was livid, demanding private meetings with Mom, after which she seemed defeated. The scholarship was quietly renamed the Eleanor Wright Community Fund, with no mention of my father. By then, I'd started noticing discrepancies, missing artwork from my father's collection, documents I wasn't allowed to see, and hushed conversations that stopped when I entered rooms. There was a secret at the heart of the Wright family, and it involved my father. After graduation, I took a job in Seattle, partly to escape and partly because Mom insisted I'd live my own life. The family narrative became that I'd abandoned her in her time of need. What they didn't know was that Mom and I spoke daily. She sent me packages, old photographs, letters, and, in the last year, a safety deposit box key with a note, "For after I'm gone. I'm sorry I wasn't braver sooner." I flew back monthly, staying at hotels rather than the family home, visiting when Uncle Richard was out. The secret between us was the only thing that felt real in our relationship. She was gathering evidence, she said, to make things right. 2 weeks ago, she called me for the last time. "Katie," she whispered, her voice weaker than I'd ever heard it. "Promise you'll read it. All of it. They'll try to stop you, but it's time for the truth." She died the next morning before I could get on a plane. The Wright family doesn't do anything halfway, not even funerals. Mom's memorial service was scheduled at St. Bartholomew's Episcopal Church, the same church where she'd been baptized, confirmed, and married. Uncle Richard had taken complete control of the arrangements before I even landed at Logan Airport. "We've already handled everything," he informed me over the phone as my Uber crawled through Boston traffic. "The family will gather at 7 for dinner tonight. We need to present a united front tomorrow." I checked into the Fairmont instead of staying at the family estate. When I arrived at dinner, the tension was immediate. Cousin Elizabeth hugged me stiffly, whispering, "You should have come home sooner." Richard Jr. barely acknowledged me, while Charlotte, the youngest and the only cousin I'd ever been close to, gave me a genuine embrace that earned her a sharp look from Aunt Vivian. "Catherine," Uncle Richard addressed me across the mahogany dining table that had witnessed decades of Wright family politics. "We've arranged for the minister to speak, followed by myself and then the choir. The service will be dignified, as your mother would have wanted." "I'd like to speak too," I said, pushing my untouched salmon around the plate. She was my mother. Silverware froze midair. Richard's face tightened. "I don't think that would be appropriate, considering." "Considering what?" I challenged. "Considering you've been 3,000 miles away while we cared for her," Aunt Vivian interjected. "What could you possibly have to say that wouldn't seem performative?" Before I could respond, the family attorney, Mr. Holloway, entered the dining room. He'd been my grandfather's lawyer and had served the family for over 40 years. "I apologize for interrupting dinner," he said, nodding politely. "I have some papers that need signatures before tomorrow." Uncle Richard stood quickly. "We can handle this in the study." "Actually," Mr. Holloway said, his eyes finding mine, "I need Catherine's signature as well. Eleanor left specific instructions." Richard's face flushed. "Whatever it is, I have Eleanor's power of attorney. There's no need to bother Catherine with paperwork now." Mr. Holloway stood his ground. "Your power of attorney expired with her death, Richard. Catherine is an executor." The word hung in the air like a gunshot. Executor. Not Richard. Me. "There must be some mistake," Richard said, his voice dangerously low. "Let's discuss this privately." I followed them to the study, where Mr. Holloway handed me a document confirming my role as co-executor alongside Mr. Holloway himself. Uncle Richard wasn't mentioned at all. "This isn't what we discussed," Richard hissed at the attorney. "Eleanor wasn't in her right mind these last months." "She was perfectly lucid when she made these changes last year," Mr. Holloway replied calmly, "and the witnesses were unimpeachable." I signed where indicated, watching Uncle Richard's knuckles turn white as he gripped the back of a leather chair. "The reading of the full will is scheduled for next week," Mr. Holloway told me, "but Eleanor left instructions that you should have this immediately." He handed me a sealed envelope. Back in my hotel room, I opened it to find a letter from my mother and a copy of a section of her will. As I read through the night, pieces of the puzzle fell into place. The next morning, a courier delivered the complete document with a note from Mr. Holloway, in case of objections. The church was filled beyond capacity when I arrived. I clutched both my prepared eulogy and my mother's will as I took my seat in the front pew. Throughout the minister's opening remarks and Uncle Richard's perfectly crafted speech about family loyalty and my mother's brave struggle, I felt a strange calm settling over me. When Richard returned to his seat, he leaned over and whispered, "I've informed the minister there will be no additional speakers. This isn't the time for dramatics, Catherine." I noticed Charlotte giving me a subtle nod of encouragement from across the pew. As the choir began to sing, I stood and walked deliberately toward the podium. I heard the rustle of surprise, saw the minister's confusion. Uncle Richard moved quickly, intercepting me at the steps to the altar. "You shouldn't speak, Kate. Nobody wants to hear from you after what you did," he whispered harshly, his fingers digging into my arm. I looked back at my mother's casket, adorned with white lilies and orchids, and knew exactly what I needed to do. I approached the podium with steady steps, aware of the confused murmurs rippling through the congregation. The minister hovered uncertainly nearby as I adjusted the microphone. Uncle Richard had returned to his seat, but his glare burned into me. "My mother, Eleanor Wright Harrison," I began, deliberately using both her names, "was a woman caught between worlds, between duty and desire, between truth and the stories we tell ourselves." I glanced down at the papers in my hands, then set aside my prepared eulogy. I was going to share memories of my mother today, of her passion for gardening, her quiet humor, how she'd recite Emily Dickinson while brushing my hair as a child. But instead, I feel compelled to honor her final wish. Uncle Richard shifted forward in his seat. Aunt Vivian's hand clutched at her pearl necklace. My mother left specific instructions that in the event I was prevented from speaking at her funeral, certain portions of her will should be read immediately rather than at the formal reading next week. Mr. Holloway nodded almost imperceptibly from his seat near the back. I unfolded the legal document. "I, Eleanor Margaret Wright Harrison, being of sound mind, hereby make the following declarations and bequests," I read, my voice growing stronger with each word. "First, I acknowledge that upon the death of my husband, Daniel Harrison, I entered into a legal agreement with my brother, Richard Wright, transferring temporary management of Daniel's patents and research findings to the Wright Pharmaceutical Holdings." Gasps echoed through the church. Uncle Richard stood abruptly. "Catherine, this is inappropriate." "This agreement," I continued, raising my voice over his, "was meant to last 5 years, after which all intellectual property and resulting profits were to revert to a trust for my daughter, Catherine Ann Harrison." My brother violated this agreement, concealed documents, and fraudulently maintained control of assets rightfully belonging to my daughter for 28 years. Uncle Richard stormed toward the podium. "This is preposterous!" Eleanor was confused. "Furthermore," I pressed on, "I direct that all profits from patent WP473B, the marine enzyme stabilization process developed by Daniel Harrison, which has generated approximately $340 million in revenue since its commercial application, be immediately transferred to the control of my daughter along with all accumulated interest and investment returns." The church erupted in shocked conversations. Cousin Elizabeth's mouth hung open. Richard Jr. stared at his father in disbelief. "My brother used my illness and his position of trust to manipulate me into silence," I read, feeling tears threatening but forcing them back. "He threatened to contest custody of my daughter should I reveal the truth. I have lived with this shame for too long. With my death, I release us both from this burden of secrecy." Uncle Richard reached the podium, his face contorted with rage. "Stop this immediately!" "Finally," I said, looking directly at him, "I revoke the establishment of the Eleanor Wright Community Fund and reinstate the original Harrison Wright Scholarship for Marine Biology as planned, to be funded and administered solely by my daughter, Catherine." I turned to the stunned congregation. "My father wasn't just some academic my mother married during a rebellious phase. He was a brilliant scientist whose work has saved countless lives through medications many of you probably take. His discovery, which revolutionized how certain proteins are delivered in the bloodstream, was stolen by the Wright family after his death." "That's enough!" Uncle Richard shouted, trying to grab the papers from my hands. My mother kept evidence, original research notes, contracts, correspondence, even recordings of conversations. It's all then provided to the authorities and to the family attorney. I looked at my uncle. She protected me the only way she felt she could, by staying close to you. But in the end, she chose the truth. Aunt Vivian had risen, pulling at Richard's arm, trying to defuse the situation. Too late. You manipulated a grieving widow and stole from her child, I said, my voice breaking slightly. You built the second phase of the right fortune on my father's genius while erasing him from our family history. Uncle Richard's face had gone from red to ashen. Mr. Holloway had moved to stand near the altar, a silent confirmation of everything I'd said. Mom wanted me to tell you all that she's sorry, not for what's in the will, but for waiting until death to find her courage. I folded the papers carefully. I'm not making the same mistake. I stepped away from the podium, walked past my stunned relatives, down the center aisle and out of the church into the bright September sunshine. Behind me, I could hear the chaos erupting, accusations, denials, the minister's futile attempts to restore order. But I kept walking, my mother's final gift clutched in my hands. The truth, and with it, my freedom. The aftermath was nuclear. I checked into a different hotel under my mother's maiden name, knowing the family would be looking for me. Charlotte found me anyway, texting, "You brave, crazy person. Can we talk?" We met in the hotel restaurant, where she slid into the booth with red-rimmed eyes. "It's bedlam," she reported, stirring her untouched coffee. "Uncle Richard had some kind of panic attack after you left. They took him to Mass General." She leaned forward. "Is it true? All of it?" I showed her copies of my father's original research journals, the patent applications filed 3 months after his death with Uncle Richard's name prominently displayed, and the trust documents my mother had secretly established last year. "I had no idea," Charlotte whispered. "None of us did. I always wondered why they were so cruel to you. It was guilt." The next morning, Richard Jr. appeared at my door, unannounced and uncharacteristically disheveled. "Dad's asking for you," he said flatly. "The doctors are keeping him for observation, but," he swallowed hard, "he wants to talk." At the hospital, Uncle Richard looked diminished against the white sheets, monitoring equipment beeping softly beside him. When I entered, he dismissed the private nurse with a weak wave. "You've destroyed this family," he said, his voice hoarse. "You did that 28 years ago," I replied, calmly, remaining near the door. He was silent for a long moment. "Your father's work wasn't ready. The stabilization process had flaws. People could have died." "So you fixed it and took all the credit, all the money?" "I protected the family. Eleanor was in no condition to handle the business side after Daniel died. She was falling apart." He adjusted himself against the pillows with a wince. "It was supposed to be temporary. For 5 years, not 3 decades. The money went to the family. You benefited too. The best schools, the best doctors for your mother." "Scraps from my own inheritance," I said, "and you made sure I felt like a charity case receiving them." He looked away. "Your mother agreed to the arrangement, under duress, while grieving, with a small child to protect." I moved closer. "She left evidence of the threats you made. The recordings are quite clear." Something broke in his expression then. "She was recording our conversations? My own sister? For the last 5 years. Ever since you shut down the scholarship in my father's name." Mr. Holloway had filled me in on the details I hadn't known. When my mother's illness progressed, she'd begun secretly documenting everything. The safety deposit box contained thumb drives, notarized statements, and a journal detailing Uncle Richard's manipulation. There was even a statement from my grandfather, recorded before his death, expressing regret for allowing Richard to handle the Harrison situation inappropriately. 2 days later, the formal reading of the will revealed even more. Mom had left the family estate to Charlotte, the only right who had shown me consistent kindness. Elizabeth received the vacation properties with strict provisions they couldn't be sold or transferred to her father. Richard Jr. got the family art collection, minus my father's marine photographs, which returned to me. Uncle Richard received $1 and a letter my mother had written him, the contents of which I'll never know. Whatever it said left him silent and shaken. The most unexpected discovery came when Mr. Holloway mentioned an annual donation my mother had been making to a small marine research station in Rockport, Maine. When I visited, I found scientists still using refined versions of my father's techniques. The director, Dr. Lori Chen, had been my father's research assistant. "Eleanor kept us going all these years," she told me over coffee in the station's small kitchen. "She made us promise never to tell anyone who our benefactor was." She led me to a laboratory where a plaque hung by the door, the Daniel Harrison Innovation Lab, Est 1992. "Your mother funded this lab the same year your father's patent was commercialized," Dr. Chen explained. "She couldn't publicly honor him, but she made sure his real work continued." I traced my fingers over my father's name. She never told me. "She visited twice a year," Dr. Chen said softly. "Brought pictures of you, told us about your accomplishments." The revelation hit me like a wave. All those spa weekends and charity retreats my mother had scheduled during my childhood were actually pilgrimages here, to this piece of my father she'd managed to preserve. Back in Massachusetts, the legal machinery was already in motion. The family lawyers tried to contest the will, claiming undue influence, but Mr. Holloway had prepared for this. My mother had undergone multiple psychological evaluations over the previous year, establishing her competence. The recordings and documentation made Richard's position indefensible. 3 weeks after the funeral, Richard signed settlement papers. In exchange for my agreement not to pursue criminal charges for fraud, he relinquished all claims to the patents and profits. The family business would undergo restructuring with independent oversight. Elizabeth and Richard Jr. refused to speak to me, but Charlotte and I grew closer. She'd found her own documents in the family office, evidence that Uncle Richard had systematically isolated my mother and me while controlling the narrative about my father. "He told us you resented the family," Charlotte confessed during a walk along the harbor, "but you blamed us for your father's death somehow." "I never knew how he died," I admitted. "Mom would only say it was an accident." Charlotte squeezed my hand. "There's something else you should see." In the library of the family estate, now Charlotte's home, she showed me a newspaper archive she'd discovered. The article described my father's death, not a diving accident as I'd been told, but a boating collision near the research station. The other vessel belonged to Wright Pharmaceuticals. "It might have been genuinely accidental," Charlotte said carefully, "but Uncle Richard was on the boat. He was there when your father died." The final piece clicked into place. Uncle Richard's visceral hatred of me, my father's convenient death just as his research was proving valuable, my mother's trapped existence. I took the Harrison Wright Scholarship Fund and expanded it, establishing a research fellowship at my father's old station. With my newly recovered inheritance, I created a foundation focused on making crucial medications more affordable, a direct challenge to the price gouging practices that had made the Wrights so wealthy. 6 months after the funeral, I received a letter from Uncle Richard. Inside was a flash drive and a brief note. "Your mother wasn't the only one with recordings. Your father's last words. I've lived with them too long. I haven't found the courage to listen to it yet. The Wright family empire is diminished but surviving. Richard stepped down from all operational roles. The family name no longer dominates Boston society pages. Meanwhile, I divided my time between Seattle and Maine, learning about the father I barely remembered through his work and colleagues. Last week, I found a sealed envelope among my mother's personal effects, addressed to me in her handwriting with instructions to open it when you're ready to forgive me. Inside was a single photograph of her and my father holding me as an infant, standing on a rocky Maine beach. On the back, she'd written, "The truth demands courage, but so does love. I failed at one, never at the other." I keep that photograph on my desk at the Research Foundation now. It reminds me that family legacies aren't always what they seem, and that courage can come too late or just in time. My mother's final act freed us both. In exposing the truth she'd hidden for decades, she returned to me not just my inheritance, but my history. The Wright family saga continues without me, though Charlotte visits often. We're building a different kind of family bond, one based on truth rather than obligation. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I just delivered the eulogy I'd prepared, taken my nominal bequest, and returned to my life in Seattle. The old Kate might have done that, avoided conflict, accepted the narrative others created. But standing at that podium, I chose to be my father's daughter too, someone who pursues truth no matter how uncomfortable. If there's one thing I've learned from this journey, it's that secrets don't protect the people we love. They only postpone inevitable reckonings. The truth has its own timeline, its own way of surfacing when we least expect it. So if you're facing your own family secrets or long-buried truths, remember, it's never too late to rewrite your story. The most powerful legacy we leave isn't money or status, but the courage to face reality with open eyes. If you found meaning in my story, please subscribe to hear more journeys of truth and transformation. Leave a comment below if you've ever had to stand up to family expectations or uncover hidden truths of your own. Remember, sometimes the most important inheritance isn't what's written in a will, but the strength to honor your own voice.